this video, What Makes This Band Awesome, Episode 2. The band is Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin beginnings. This is a band that came about because of basically Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. Jimmy Page was a session musician, and so was John Paul Jones, the bassist. They had been in bands previously, namely probably the most well-known obviously was Page, because he was in a band called the Yardbirds that was relatively established. But the other three, like Bonham, Jones, and Plant and Bonham were in a band called Band of Joy before the formation. And John Paul Jones, I don't know why I can't say this guy's name, was, like I said, a relatively well-known session musician at the time. But when these four came together to form the group, they were originally going by the name the New Yardbirds, which at the time they were only allowed to use this name on their very first tour of Scandinavia. But even when they went to the United States for their first tour, they were still using the name, but they were forced to change it. So supposedly the name Led Zeppelin came from a conversation that happened between the band members and two of the band members from the band The Who, which would have been Keith Moon and John Entwistle, the bass player. They made a joke about how they thought a supergroup, the supergroup idea would go over like quote unquote a lead balloon. So that's the genesis of the name, but how it came to be as we know it today was obviously that exchange, but also Zeppelin's tour manager decided to drop the A out of lead, so it became LED Zeppelin, which, you know, was probably wound up being a good move, because that made the name probably more distinctive and stood out more, which is what you want when you're in a band and trying to get exposure. But anyway, they released their first album, which was just simply titled Led Zeppelin, self-titled, and that album came out in June of 1969. The band was probably, for lack of a word, probably an originator. Obviously the Beatles and Stones had done a little bit of experimentation with their music, but the second Zeppelin album, it kind of was more or less an extension of the first one, but it was the third album, Led Zeppelin 3, which came out in October of 1970, that the band started to use more acoustic elements. But I want to talk about that more in the section what makes this band awesome. We're just, for this section, it's more just on how the group came to be formed. So let's hop to it. So, what makes Led Zeppelin so damn awesome? Well, it's a lot of things. And being that they're like one of the most well-known bands in history, I mean, a lot of these things have probably been talked about a million times, but in case you did not know, um, around the time that Led Zeppelin was formed, there wasn't a lot of bands that you could probably describe today as hard rock. Um, Jimi Hendrix probably would fit that description for, I'm talking strictly from that time period. Jimi Hendrix's band, Cream would probably fit that description. Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, when they came on in the early 70s. And one that's kind of overlooked is Blue Cheer from the United States. They definitely had a pretty powerful thing going on. But how would we best describe Led Zeppelin? Well, in my opinion, yeah, they're hard rock, but what did they bring to the table for that time period? Why were they so unique? My description of them would be, I would probably use the term power blues, because they obviously were steeped heavily in American blues, both electric blues and country blues. But they also infused other elements into their music. Jimmy Page is often quoted as saying they were a band that was trying to highlight the concept of light and shade, which, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But I would also say styles like jazz, soul, reggae. I mean, they threw a lot of things in there, to even folk music. They were big on that, especially British folk music and Celtic music. They had a pretty good gumbo pot going on with all these different musical styles to create something at the time relatively new and different. I mean, maybe not radically so, but it definitely took the world by, it gave the world notice. But I can tell you though that the rock critics at the time did not like this band. Maybe some critics from the Village Voice or something like that might have given a good review here and there, but bands like magazines like Rolling Stone, initially were not very kind to Led Zeppelin, which is, I guess, looking back on it, kind of unfair, but I guess at the time they felt like they were too bombastic, or something along those lines. But when you look at all four members of this group, this is what truly makes them an awesome band. One for the ages, probably won't be replicated again. Even though a band like Greta Van Fleet is trying their hardest, bless their heart, to bring back that kind of sound. And this is not a knock on them. I don't think they're a bad band or anything. I just don't think, and they are relatively successful. So don't get the wrong idea. But are they ever going to be the level of success that's Led Zeppelin, or is any band ever going to be at that level again? Probably not. But the four members forming this group is probably what made them stand out among their peers at that time, because there were some good bands out in the 70s, but let's think about this for a second. You had basically four almost genius level musicians in the same band, which you know that's that's hard. I mean, it's hard enough to be a successful band to begin with, but to have four people at that high of a level is just is almost mind-boggling. It's no wonder that they were as successful as they were. I mean, Robert Plant, you know, really good vocals. You know, a pretty good lyricist as well. Jimmy Page, you know, session guitarist extraordinaire. He brought a lot of different flavors to their sound. John Bonham obviously providing that massive backbeat, but just a force, a presence. And then probably their secret weapon, yes, I said it, their secret weapon, John Paul Jones. Why, you ask? Well, what often gets overlooked with him is he was a really good arranger. A lot of their songs he had a lot of input in, and especially in their later years, he did a lot of their arranging. And of course, you know, post Led Zeppelin, he's done, you know, he's produced a lot of bands, and he's really he performs at a high level arranging music. So you mix that all together into this cake batter, and you just have this amazing band. It's really incredible the work that they put out in such a short period of time, because a lot of people don't realize this band was only together basically 10 years. When John Bonham passed away in 1980, they essentially just quit that day. I mean, there was some stuff released after that, but that's, you know, it wasn't really as a band, it was after the fact. But for a solid 10 years, they put out some of the most iconic music in rock history. So that's that, you know, you got to tip your hat to that. That's definitely a feather in the cap. But for me personally, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I can remember hearing songs like obviously Stairway to Heaven, because was the most requested song in the 1970s. That is a fact. That's the #1 requested song. So obviously you're going to hear that growing up if you grew up in that era. But I also remember hearing songs like Black Dog and Rock and Roll. I heard those on the radio. So that was probably my first exposure to the band growing up. But it wasn't really until the 1980s I got a copy of a LP, you know, back when we actually listened to records. Some people still do, but vinyl was still kind of a thing in the 80s. It was even in its the years that it kind of went into a lull. That all probably started in the 80s. So to have a vinyl LP was a kind of rare, I guess you could say, because most people were listening to either cassette or 8-track at that time. But I was given a LP of Houses of the Holy, and I happened to have a record player on my stereo, so you know, obviously I listened to it, and some of the songs I had heard off the album on the radio, but some of the deeper cuts on that album were really good, and that's really what sparked my interest in the band. Because before that, I knew who the band was, you know, just through osmosis, I guess. You know, I knew, you know, Stairway to Heaven, Led Zeppelin, you know, I knew that. But I didn't really know much about the band other than that they were from England. But that got, like I said, that piqued my interest, and that's when I really started to pay attention to them. And in the '80s, they weren't exactly a, I guess you could say they kind of were falling out of popularity. Well, I mean, okay, let me rephrase that. Still one of the most popular bands in history, even into the '80s, even up until today. But in the 1980s, especially when like hip hop started to become more prevalent, hair metal bands, all that kind of stuff. People still listen to Led Zeppelin, but you're not going to hear it booming out of somebody's car like left and right, like hip hop was or something. But yeah, like I was saying, just it got the ball rolling for me. So I started paying more attention to them, started finding out everything I could about them, and discovered their back catalog. And this was probably around 87 or 88, I want to say 1988. And ever since then, became more and more and more of a fan. And obviously to this day, I know way more about them than I did in the '80s. But anyway, that's how I feel. That's my opinion on why I think they were an awesome band. Tell me what you think about it. Are they as awesome as people say? Or are you just kind of like, meh, they're not that wonderful? Tell me what you think. Okay, kind of sticking with the format that I came up with. I mean, I'm just going to follow that format kind of loosely. It's not necessarily going to be, I'm not going to hold that to a hard standard, but starting with the last video I did, I want to talk a little bit about controversies, because obviously this band had some over the years, maybe more than people realize, but well, let's just kind of talk about it here for a minute. One of the things that drew, I guess you could say, negative attention to, but kind of like they say in the music business, any publicity is good publicity, but I don't really want to call it negative, but I guess really all of these could be considered negative, depending on your point of view. But the first one I'm going to kind of just cover, especially in the United States during the 1980s, there was a big, I guess, kind of a revival in fundamentalist religious types, and they would go on these witch hunts saying this band or that band is promoting Satanism or some kind of nonsense like that. But yes, Jimmy Page, and even to an extent Robert Plant, did have an interest in things like mysticism and black magic, the occult, things in that nature. I would say it was probably more Jimmy Page than Robert Plant, though. But Jimmy Page was into Aleister Crowley. Some people even said he was obsessed with him, but take that for what it's worth. He may or may not have been. He has said in interviews that he was somewhat obsessed with him, but just like with all things in life, it probably faded with time. But I'm sure he got some personal beliefs from some of that focus. But anyway, to go back to what we're talking about here, there's some people were trying to link Led Zeppelin to Satanism, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And they're even to the point where they were saying that there were backmasked messages, which backmasking means playing something in reverse, in case you didn't know that. The thing with backmasking is when you hear that, because it's such it's not real language that we know. It's just basically gibberish. That can be interpreted like a thousand different ways. So if you're looking at something thinking you're going to see Satanism, then that's probably what you're going to see. But that doesn't mean that's what's actually there. So yeah, they got accused of that, but obviously it's a bogus claim. But what is not a bogus claim, and this is probably the most troubling one of all, is well, let me go to this one first. Sometime in the early '70s, the band played a show in Seattle, and this is some people say it's an urban legend, and there's other people that were actually there said no, it actually happened. So draw your own conclusions. But supposedly, either some of the band members, some of the road crew, or a different band known as Vanilla Fudge, who was on tour with them, supposedly violated a woman with a fish or a shark. Most likely a shark. And the story goes that she was tied up and, had parts of the fish crammed into her body. So that's what supposedly happened, and that was very controversial for years. But not more controversial than the next one, which was Jimmy Page had a 14-year-old girlfriend. Now this we know actually happened, and in this day and age that would not be looked at very favorably. But he got away with it in the 70s because it was the 70s and he was a rock star, and I guess things like that, either known or unknown, happened, and it was just overlooked, or people looked the other way, or for whatever reason people were not prosecuted, or charges brought upon them, or whatever. That's not to say that charges never happen against somebody who did something like that, but I guess it all depends on when and where. I think this particular case happened in Los Angeles, so I guess either the police or the district attorney or whoever just didn't know it happened, so that's why nothing ever came of it. But yeah, that's probably the most troubling thing in this band's history. But they were also known for their hard partying, their debauchery, like kind of like what I was talking about a minute ago. Some of their behavior is might be a little overblown. Yeah, they did trash hotel rooms and things like that. That did happen, but maybe not quite to the extent that some of the legends that swirl around this band. I do know they were banned from life from a hotel in Tokyo. Supposedly they trashed a room there pretty. I think it was the Tokyo Hilton, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, and John Bonham was known to ride his motorcycle through the hotel, things like that. Banned fishing out of windows, throwing TVs, that kind of thing. But I guess the last thing I can mention is the death of John Bonham. He died alcohol poisoning, asphyxia from alcohol poisoning. Supposedly when they found him, when they tested his blood alcohol level, he had the equivalent of 40 vodka shots in his bloodstream, is what was reported. But surprisingly enough, he didn't have any illegal drugs in his system. He did have some drugs in the system, but those were prescription drugs, not not narcotics. It was stuff he was taking for anxiety. But that's pretty much it for this video. Tell me what you think about Led Zeppelin. I already mentioned this before, but did you think that this was a band that was worthy of its accolades? Are they overrated? Are they underrated? Tell me what you think. Drop some likes, comments, whatever you feel like. And that's going to be it for this episode of what makes this band awesome. Thank you and good night.